morning, and welcome to another edition of Brewin on Broad Street. I'm Steve Snyder, entrepreneur in residence here at Gesmer, and I'm here with my good friend Paul Snape. Welcome.
Thank you.
I would love to hear about you and Great British Marketing, GPM.
Absolutely. So my name's Paul Snape, and I live in New England, just about an hour outside of Boston, usually when the traffic isn't horrific. And I help businesses on both sides of the pond land and explore and grow each other's markets. So British companies coming over here, British government interests as well, and likewise from over here, American businesses that want to go to Europe and also states and regions in the US as well.
So I can tell by your accent that you're not originally from here.
I'm a northerner from near Leeds in the UK, a place called Harrogate, which is a beautiful part of the world. Ran a business or several businesses there for 25 years, something like that. And during that period, married an American who eventually wanted to move back to the US. So about 10 years ago, we started exploring the opportunities to use some of what we were doing in the US market. So that's why I end up being a dual citizen now and resident in Rhode Island, which is a beautiful neck of the woods. Everybody thinks is near New York, and it isn't. It's very near Boston. But that's where I've come up from this morning.
So it's not just the marketing expertise that you provide, but you have so much business experience, you provide that perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, I've started a PR agency originally, going back to 1998 after working for some global PR players, Omnicom-owned PR businesses. And that business actually is still in existence and still runs from Yorkshire, which is why I go back every 8 weeks or so at the moment. In the period of running that business, I wrote a business plan, raised $1 million, launched a disruptive publishing venture, and ran that for about 7 years before it was going in a direction I didn't want to go and got off. And at that point, I decided to investigate the US market. So I've always kind of had two things going at the same time. I understand the dynamics of fundraising, Series A, Series B. I've been a COO, bootstrapping a business on the ground. I've raised money, and I've lost money. So yeah, I kind of understand the startup journey as well.
As I've said to you many times, I work with many hundreds of companies here in the US, but I have so much fun working with companies that start outside of the US and want to set up operations here. So many dozens have been from the UK, and you and I have worked together with many of those.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for entrepreneurs that are coming from other parts of the world, particularly the UK, that want to set up operations here in the US?
I think there are some really obvious ones that you assume that people are going to already know, but it's not until you get on the ground here. And one of the first things I did when I was preparing for opening the doors here was I went around to every British consulate that I could in the US. And I think I got to 5 before I ran out of budget and time to do it. The US is massive. It is absolutely enormous. The scale of it, the seasonal differences, there are all sorts of problems that scale brings. Time differences is obvious as well. And so understanding or trying to immerse yourself a little bit in how long it takes to get from A to B is a real practical learning curve you need to go through. Everything costs more. It's going to take longer because of the scale and because it costs more and because people's diaries are busy. Everything takes longer, it costs more, and it's an enormous country. That all sounds really negative. The prize is enormous, but it doesn't come without any drag or any costs. And so that's the first thing. And the other thing as well is I've worked with a load of companies. Some of them are really open-minded and tech-focused and really, of the age now. Some of them are basing experiences on what you might have seen on the TV or what they learned 20 years ago when they went to Florida. And so I would advocate that people really take your head off about what an American is, how an American buys, what drives an American. I've lived here now for 8 years, and I can tell you that they've got all sorts of different pressures on them. They've got a different working style, a different cadence of their career, and that's because education costs $250,000 for a college student, and because healthcare is a real reason to have a job, and so. They're different people that work differently. They're really positive. I really like that. We've said this in meetings before, haven't we? And there is an optimism, and this is a quantitative fact that Americans are more optimistic than most other countries, and that is a fantastic thing to be working with. But there are hundreds of different ways that they're different. So the main advice is throw yourself in. Don't underestimate how big it is, how much it will cost, how long it will take, but embrace the culture. I've said this before in our company, like Americans, because without liking to them, you can't sell to them. Without selling to them, you can't have a business.
Just 2 weeks ago, you and I had the pleasure of working on a roundtable as part of a roundtable sponsored by the British Consulate here in Boston. And one of the things that was mentioned was that so often entrepreneurs from other parts of the world view the U.S. as a single market, when in fact it is multiple markets and very different markets, and that certainly makes things a bit more complex, as you said.
It does, but it also gives you permission to see the challenge as not so overwhelming. If you can break the market down, the Northeast is a great example, and break it down however you want. Break it down by time zone. Break it down by, if you're in fashion, you might want to do it by season. If you're in logistics, you might want to do it by UPS code. There are many different ways to break the markets down. I've got a client who does ship little things like little pots of paint, and so we were just talking last week about, well, how is he going to break down the US in terms of franchise agreements that he's going to sell? And we ended up on the very practical approach of, right, well, let's work out, we don't want anything to take longer than 2 days to ship. So that is your patch. And so you've got to break the market down. It is massive. But when you've done that, you'll feel a lightness, I think, because then it gives you permission, a bit like the UK. The UK and Europe, think of New England as the UK, and then think of Northern Europe as other parts, but yeah.
So that's a great segue to the next question, which is, you've provided advice to entrepreneurs coming here. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs of U.S. companies that want to go abroad?
Well, again, a lot of them you flip on the head. I mean, it is a very different country. The UK, let's start with the UK, because a lot of the people we work with initially want to talk about the UK and then realise that actually we can move into Europe. And then, we have one electronics client in the US who we work with globally. And that started with addressing a specific need from the US market to the UK, where they needed some more support. But the incremental additional effort that was needed to spread that across Europe, see the same returns on the investment, do it in the US, in the domestic market, and see those returns, and then turn it on around the rest of the world was so little that it just makes sense. And so that stepstone approach works in the UK. The UK, I will say, in terms of doing business, I always say that the US have got the value of time and money worked out. Time is the only thing you can't replace. You can always replace capital and money, and there's a difference there. So in a UK startup or in business, quite often there's more focus put on the cost of something rather than the time it will save. So you've got to get your head around that. It's very different in the US, and I think the US have that right. In addition to that, you'll get a no, right? I always say it's the most difficult word to get in the US is a no. If someone doesn't like your product, they might not necessarily tell you. They will talk about the positives in a way that you are used to hearing as a Brit is quite a positive thing. And actually what they're meaning is, I don't want to say I don't like it, or I don't want to say it's not for us. And I'd rather maybe not return your call or your email or what have you. So it's harder to get a no in the US. In the UK, you'll get a no, and you might think that that's rude. It isn't rude. It's the British aren't awful people. You know, they're quite direct. But I actually look at the positives of that. You're going to get a great load of market feedback that you wouldn't have got otherwise. You won't be spending money and time chasing down blind alleys. So don't take it personally is the other thing as well in that regard. You might get very direct, very blunt advice or feedback. Just take the positives out of it.
A yes is always the best answer.
Yeah.
A no is the second best answer, and no answer is the worst.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, I've been in situations working with clients where we've pitched a product, we've sent expensive samples, and we hear nothing. Like for months, we hear nothing. And then on a Friday, I just got an email with a PDF attached. No liaison whatsoever for the biggest order that we'd ever got. So zero feedback, zero sort of clues as to whether or not we should carry on progressing this conversation. When it's falling on deaf ears, you feel a little bit like you're being ghosted by somebody. And then all of a sudden, a windfall of this order that, you know, effectively you've had to do little about. So that is a big difference. You'll not usually get that in the UK unless you're in a tendering situation where there's a regulatory reason.
Yeah. I know how passionate you are about marketing, but you have another passion. It's sailing.
Yes, I've become a little bit addicted to sailing in recent years, in lockdown actually. But yes, I first sailed in Barbados about 15 years ago with my wife on vacation, sailing Hobie Cats, and just kind of fell in love with it. And then in lockdown, I was supposed to go back there, and one of the main reasons on my 50th was to do that again. And I hadn't really realised that I'd moved to an area in the US that is renowned for its sailing. We're right on Narragansett Bay, and we were in lockdown. There wasn't much you could do, and my wife said, well, we're not going on holiday. Why don't you go to the sailing school that she'd found for me on the internet? So I have her to blame. I reiterate that to her every time I spend any money on one of these websites that I spend small amounts of money on. But I've got a small boat now, and I've done a few courses, and I single hand as my mental health, I would say.
When we do this again, and I hope you'll join me again, maybe we can film on your boat.
Yeah, there's not much room. It's not like a super yacht or anything like that. And I will say, actually, the other thing that reignited my sailing was coming to your regattas, I will say. So that was a really, yourself and Bill and some of the other people that I've met doing the regatta in Boston. It's a fantastic thing, and that really contributed as well. I should have mentioned that earlier. But yeah, by all means, let's do that. It'll have a slightly different effect. We might be quite close together, but that'll be fun.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining me today.
Not at all.
And thank you for joining us in Brewin on Broad Street. We'll see you again soon.